The afternoon light fell across the polished mahogany of the Stanhope Park dining table, Fritz touching the edge of Lady Phoebe Carteret's gloved hand as she lifted a square of ivory silk and held it to the window. Margot Hollis stood 3 paces behind her. A silver tray of pins balanced in her left palm, her spine straight and her gaze steady on the fabric samples spread across the table like a cartographer's survey of wealth. Phoebe tilted the silk, watching the light shift across the weave, and Margot noticed the smallest crease forming between her mistress's brows, the expression Phoebe wore when calculating whether a thing was worth its price. The dining room was quiet, except for the rustle of fabric and the distant sound of the groundskeeper's cart on gravel. And Margot had learned in 6 months of service that silence in this house was a kind of permission. As long as she held the pins and did not speak, she was invisible. And invisibility was the safest position a maid could occupy. The door opened without a knock, and Mr. Aldridge entered with the particular stride of a solicitor who carried urgent news, but had been trained never to appear hurried. He was a narrow man with spectacles that caught the light in small flashes, and he carried a leather document case under one arm. Phoebe did not look up from the silk. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "the Duke is in the study." "I am aware, my lady," Aldridge replied, and there was something in his voice that made Margot's fingers tighten around the tray. "I apologize for the interruption. I need to speak with His Grace about the title search for the marriage settlement. It is a matter that requires immediate attention." Phoebe set down the silk and turned in her chair, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to polite interest. "The title search? I thought that was completed weeks ago." Aldridge hesitated, his gaze flicking briefly to Margot and then back to Phoebe. "The preliminary search was completed, my lady. However, a secondary review of the county registry has revealed a complication." "What sort of complication?" Aldridge opened the document case and withdrew a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges and covered in script that Margot could not read from where she stood. He placed it on the table beside the silk samples with the careful precision of a man handling evidence in a courtroom. "The marriage settlement includes the dower house and its surrounding grounds as part of your jointure," Aldridge said. "The registry shows a prior claim on that property, a deed filed in 1786, properly witnessed and recorded, but never fulfilled. The deed names a Samuel Crewe as the legal owner." A different kind of quiet descended, heavier than before. Phoebe stared at the document, her head tilted slightly, as if she were trying to translate a language she did not speak. Margot felt the tray shift in her hand, the pin sliding fractionally to one side, and she steadied it with a small adjustment of her wrist that no one noticed. "A deed," Phoebe said, "to the dower house, in a surveyor's name?" Her voice was steady. "Yes, my lady." Phoebe laughed, not unkindly, but with the easy incredulity of a woman who had never questioned who owned what or why. "She's just a maid, Mr. Aldridge. Surely this is a clerical error from the last century. Some tenant farmer who was promised a cottage and never collected. It cannot possibly affect the settlement." Aldridge's expression did not change, but his fingers tightened on the edge of the document case. "The deed is properly filed, my lady. It includes a full legal description of the property, the signatures of 2 witnesses, and a notation that the deed was issued in payment for services rendered in a chancery case. If Mr. Crewe's descendants can be located—" He stopped. His gaze had shifted to Margot again, and this time it stayed. Phoebe followed his gaze, turning in her chair to look at her maid with the mild curiosity of someone noticing a piece of furniture for the first time. Margot set down the tray of pins. One by one, she placed each pin back into its velvet-lined box with the same precision her grandfather had used to mark boundary stones in winter frost. Her hands did not shake. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. Samuel Crewe was my grandfather." The laughter died. Phoebe's expression shifted from curiosity to something sharper. Calculation, perhaps, or the first stirrings of concern. Aldridge took a half-step backward, as if Margot had suddenly become something dangerous. The room held its breath long enough for Margot to hear the clock in the hall strike the hour, each chime falling into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water. Phoebe recovered first. She rose from her chair with the fluid grace of a woman trained from childhood to command a room, and she studied Margot with the same attention she had given the silk. Assessing value, measuring cost. "Your grandfather," Phoebe said. "Samuel Crewe." She nodded once. "Yes, my lady." "And you knew about this deed?" "I did not know until this moment," Margot said. "My mother told me my grandfather was owed something, and they never paid. She did not say what. She died before she could explain." Phoebe turned to Aldridge. "Is this claim legitimate?" "The deed is legitimate, my lady," Aldridge said carefully. "Whether the claim can be enforced after 40 years is a matter that would require further investigation. But the document exists, and it predates the current settlement by several decades." "Then investigate it," Phoebe said, quietly, "and inform the Duke immediately. I will not have my settlement delayed by a clerical error from 1786. She dismissed them both with a small gesture and returned to the silk samples, her posture conveying that the matter was already resolved in her mind. Margot retrieved the tray of pins and followed Aldridge into the hall, her heart beating steadily against her ribs in a rhythm that felt like her grandfather's surveying compass ticking off measurements in the cold. That evening, the housekeeper summoned Margot to the Duke's study. The message was delivered without explanation, and Margot climbed the east staircase with the same careful composure she had maintained in the dining room, though her fingers found the small brass compass in her apron pocket and closed around it. The compass her mother had given her the week before she died, the only object Samuel Crewe had left behind, that his daughter had kept. The study door was open. Duke Adrian Langford stood at the window with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him, his posture rigid in the way of a man who had been trained to command but had never learned to rest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and 31 years old, though the weight of the dukedom had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older in certain lights. Margot had seen him perhaps a dozen times in 6 months. Always at a distance, always moving through the house with the brisk efficiency of a man who had inherited a role he had not expected and was determined to perform it without error. "Miss Hollis," he said without turning, "close the door." She did. The study was lined with shelves of leather-bound books and maps, the walls covered in portraits of men who looked like Adrian, but were not. His father, his grandfather, the long succession of Langfords, who had held Stanhope Park and the Eastern Estates for 200 years. A fire burned in the grate, though the evening was not cold and the air smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Adrian turned. His gaze was direct, unsettling in its intensity. Gray eyes that seemed to measure her the way her grandfather had measured boundary lines, looking for the point where one thing ended and another began. "Mr. Aldridge tells me you are Samuel Crewe's granddaughter," he said. She met his eyes. "Yes, Your Grace." "And that you knew nothing of the deed until this afternoon." "I knew my grandfather was owed something," Margot said. "My mother told me before she died. She said he worked for this family and they never paid him. She did not tell me what he was owed or why. She only said he deserved better." Adrian crossed to the desk and picked up the same yellowed document Aldridge had shown Phoebe. He studied it for a long moment, his jaw tight. And then he set it down and looked at her again. "What do you know about your grandfather's work?" He was a surveyor, Margot said. He measured land, settled boundary disputes. My mother kept his instruments, his compass, his measuring chains, his field notebooks. She could not read the notebooks, but she kept them. She said they were proof of something, though she never said what. Do you still have the notebooks? Her answer came quickly. Yes, Your Grace. Adrian's expression shifted, something that might have been relief or might have been the first edge of hope. Bring them to me tomorrow, and tell no one else about this conversation. Do you understand? She inclined her head. Yes, Your Grace. He dismissed her with a nod, but as she reached the door, he spoke again. Miss Hollis. She turned. If your grandfather's claim is legitimate, Adrian said, this family owes you a debt that should have been paid 40 years ago. I intend to determine whether that is the case. But the investigation will take time, and it will be complicated. Are you prepared for that? Margot met his gaze without flinching. My grandfather spent 2 years in the cold, measuring boundaries for this estate, Your Grace. I can wait a few weeks for the truth. Adrian's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but something close. Then we will find it together. The estate archive occupied a long, narrow room on the second floor of the east wing, a space that smelled of dust and leather and the particular mustiness of paper that had been undisturbed for decades. Margot had never entered it before. Maid'S did not have reason to touch the records of a dukedom. But when she arrived the following morning with her grandfather's notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, Adrian was already there, standing at a table covered in ledgers and maps, his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked up when she entered, and his gaze went immediately to the bundle in her arms. The notebooks? He asked. She confirmed with a word. Yes, Your Grace. She placed them on the table and unwrapped the oilcloth carefully, revealing 2 leather-bound volumes, each about the size of a prayer book. The covers worn smooth by handling and stained dark at the edges from years of being carried in the weather. Adrian picked up the first volume and opened it, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were handling something fragile. The pages were covered in cramped, precise handwriting, columns of numbers, sketches of boundary markers, diagrams of fields and hedgerows. In the margins, Samuel Crewe had written notes in a smaller hand, observations about the weather, the quality of the light, the condition of the ground. Adrian turned the pages one by one, his expression intent, and Margot watched him read the work her grandfather had done in the winter of 1786. The measurements that had won a chancery case and secured 400 acres for a duke who had never paid what he owed. These are extraordinary, Adrian said quietly. Every measurement is recorded twice. Every boundary stone is sketched. He even noted when the chain broke and delayed the work by 2 days. My grandfather was a precise man, Margot said. Adrian looked up. He was more than precise. He was meticulous. These notebooks would stand up in any court in England. He set down the first volume and opened the second, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. A diagram of the eastern boundary. The line between Stanhope Park and the neighboring estate marked in ink that had faded to brown. Beside the diagram, Samuel Crewe had written a single sentence in his careful hand. Boundary settled in favor of Langford. Payment agreed. Dower house and grounds. Deed to be drawn upon conclusion of case. Adrian read the sentence aloud, his voice steady, and then he closed the notebook and looked at Margot. Your grandfather won the case, he said, and my grandfather promised him the dower house in payment. The deed was drawn, witnessed, and filed, but the house was never transferred. She spoke plainly. No, it was not. Adrian turned to the shelves that lined the archive walls, his gaze scanning the rows of ledgers and bound documents. The estate records go back to 1720. If your grandfather's work is documented here, we will find it. And if we find it, we will know exactly what was owed and why it was never paid. He pulled down a ledger marked 1785 to 1790 and opened it on the table beside the notebooks. Margot moved to stand beside him, close enough to see the pages, but far enough to maintain the distance a maid was expected to keep from a duke. Adrian did not seem to notice. He was already reading, his finger tracing down columns of entries. Payments to tenants, repairs to the mill, wages for laborers. Here, he said, stopping on an entry dated March of 1786. Samuel Crew, surveyor, retainer for boundary dispute, Eastern Estate. £20 advanced. Margot leaned closer, her breath catching. Adrian turned the page, scanning the entries that followed, and then he stopped again. June 1787. Chancery judgment in favor of Langford. 400 acres confirmed. Payment to S. Crew. Dower house and grounds, deed filed at county registry. There, Adrian said. Proof that the deed was filed, and proof that my grandfather acknowledged the debt. But he never transferred the house, Margot said. His voice was flat. No, he did not. They worked through the morning, pulling down ledgers and land records, tracing the history of the eastern boundary and the chancery case that had settled it. The archive grew warm as the sun climbed higher, and Margot shed her shawl and rolled up her sleeves, her hands blackened with dust as she turned pages and copied notes. The agreed payment was the Dower house and its grounds, a property worth perhaps £200. The deed had been drawn, witnessed by the estate solicitor and a magistrate, and filed at the county registry in July 1787. And then, nothing. No record of transfer, no record of payment, no record of Samuel Crew ever taking possession of the house he had been promised. Adrian sat back in his chair, his hands flat on the table, and stared at the ledger in front of him. My grandfather cheated him, he said. Margot said nothing. She had known it since the moment Aldridge had placed the deed on the dining table. But hearing Adrian say it aloud, hearing a duke admit that his family had stolen from a working man, was something else entirely. Adrian looked at her. Your grandfather did the work. He won the case. He was promised payment. The payment was documented. And then my grandfather simply did not pay. She gave him the truth. Yes. Adrian's jaw tightened. I am sorry. It was not your debt, Your Grace. It is my debt now, Adrian said, and I will pay it. The archive became their shared territory over the days that followed. Adrian ordered that Margot be given access at any hour, and the housekeeper, who disapproved but did not dare question a duke's command, left a key in Margot's room with a tight-lipped warning that she was not to disturb anything. Margot did not disturb anything. She simply read methodically and carefully through every document that mentioned Samuel Crew or the eastern boundary. And Adrian read beside her, the two of them working in a silence that felt less like the silence between a duke and a maid, and more like the silence between two people searching for the same truth. It was Margot who found the letter. It was tucked into the back of a ledger marked Correspondence 1787 to 1789. A single sheet of paper folded in half and sealed with wax that had cracked and crumbled with age. She unfolded it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly, and read the script that covered the page in the precise, formal hand of a solicitor. To Mr. Samuel Crew, Surveyor, Warwickshire. Sir, I write on behalf of His Grace the Duke of Stanhope, in response to your letter of the 12th of September regarding the Dower House. His Grace wishes to make clear that the matter of payment was settled to the satisfaction of all parties at the conclusion of the Chancery case. Any further pursuit of this matter will be regarded as an attempt to defraud the estate and will result in proceedings for fraud and trespass. You are advised to consider the matter closed and to refrain from any further correspondence. I remain, etc. G. Whitmore, Solicitor to His Grace. Margot read the letter twice, her vision narrowing to the words on the page. And then she read it aloud, her voice steady but her hands shaking so badly that the paper rattled. Adrian, who had been reading a land survey on the other side of the table, looked up sharply. "What is that?" "A letter," Margot said. "From your grandfather's solicitor to mine, dated 3 months after the Chancery judgment." She handed him the letter, and he read it in silence, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he set the letter down very carefully, as if it might burn him, and looked at her. "This is not a settlement," he said. "This is a threat." She agreed quietly. "Yes. My grandfather's solicitor threatened your grandfather with prosecution for fraud if he continued to demand payment for work he had already done." Her voice was calm. "Yes." Adrian's hands curled into fists on the table. "And your grandfather withdrew." "He had no choice," Margot said. "He was a working man. He could not afford a solicitor, and he could not risk a countersuit. So he withdrew, and he died 10 years later in a rented cottage. And my mother spent her life taking in mending because her father was cheated out of the house he earned." Adrian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and crossed to the window. He stood there with his back to her, his shoulders rigid. And Margot watched the line of his spine and knew that he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. "My grandfather used intimidation to avoid payment," Adrian said, his voice low and tight. "He threatened a man who had won him 400 acres because it was cheaper to threaten him than to pay him." She confirmed it simply. "Yes." Adrian turned. His face was pale, his jaw set, and his eyes held a fury that Margot had not seen before, not directed at her, but at the man whose portrait hung in the study downstairs, the man who had built a dukedom on the labor of people like Samuel Crewe and had never once paid what he owed. "I will pay the debt," Adrian said. "Every pound of it. The house, the arrears, whatever your grandfather was owed, I will pay it." "Your Grace—" "Do not tell me it was not my debt," Adrian said sharply. "It is my debt because I have been living in this house and managing this estate for 5 years, without once questioning where it came from or what it cost. I stood in that study last week and told Lady Phoebe that the dower house was part of her settlement, and I did not know, I did not bother to know, that the house was stolen. That ends now." Margot stood, her heart pounding, and faced him across the table. "If you acknowledge the debt, the Carteret settlement will collapse. Lady Phoebe's father will not marry his daughter into a disputed estate." "Then the settlement will collapse," Adrian said, "and Lady Phoebe will withdraw." "Then she will withdraw, and you will lose the alliance." "Then I will lose the alliance," Adrian said. "But I will not lose my integrity, not for a settlement, not for a marriage, not for anything." He crossed back to the table and picked up the letter, his hand steady now, and placed it beside Samuel Crewe's notebooks. "Your grandfather trusted my family," Adrian said, "and my family destroyed him for it. I will not repeat that." That evening, Lady Stanhope discovered the investigation. Margot was in the archive, copying the text of the solicitor's letter into her own notebook, when the door opened without a knock and Adrian's mother swept into the room. Lady Stanhope was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, her hair still dark and her posture as rigid as a portrait. She looked at Margot, then at the documents spread across the table, and her expression hardened. "What is this?" she demanded. Adrian, who had been reading a land survey near the window, set down the document and turned. "An investigation into the estate's records. I am reviewing the history of the eastern boundary." "With a maid?" "With Miss Hollis," Adrian said evenly, "whose grandfather surveyed the boundary and was never paid." Lady Stanhope's gaze flicked to Margot, and Margot saw the calculation in her eyes, the same calculation Phoebe had made in the dining room, the assessment of whether a maid's claim was worth acknowledging or dismissing. "This is absurd," Lady Stanhope said. "If there was a debt, it was settled decades ago. You cannot disrupt the Carteret settlement over a clerical error from 1787. "It was not a clerical error," Adrian said. "It was theft." Lady Stanhope's face went pale. "Adrian, my grandfather hired Samuel Crewe to survey the eastern boundary. Crewe won the chancery case that secured 400 acres for this estate. The agreed payment was the dower house. The deed was drawn, witnessed, and filed. And then my grandfather's solicitor threatened Crewe with prosecution if he continued to demand payment. That is not a settlement, Mother. That is intimidation. You cannot prove that." Adrian picked up the solicitor's letter and held it out. "I can prove it, and I will." Lady Stanhope took the letter, read it, and then set it down with a sharp exhale. "If you acknowledge this debt, the Carteret settlement will require renegotiation. Viscount Carteret will not accept a reduced jointure. He will withdraw Phoebe, and the alliance will collapse." "Then it will collapse," Adrian said. "You are willing to lose the Carteret alliance over a maid's claim?" "I am willing to lose the Carteret alliance over the truth," Adrian said. "The dower house was never ours to offer in a marriage settlement. It belongs to Samuel Crewe's family, and I will not compound my grandfather's theft by pretending otherwise." Lady Stanhope stared at him, her expression shifting from anger to something closer to disbelief. "You are risking everything your father built." "My father built nothing," Adrian said quietly. "My grandfather built this estate on land he won through Samuel Crewe's work, and he never paid for it. I am not risking everything. I am paying what was owed." Lady Stanhope turned to Margot, her gaze sharp and cold. "And you? What do you want? Money, a position, a settlement to keep this quiet?" Margot met her gaze without flinching. "I want what my grandfather was owed, my lady. The house, the acknowledgement, and the truth spoken aloud in front of the people who benefited from the theft." Lady Stanhope's mouth tightened. She turned back to Adrian. "You're making a mistake." "Perhaps," Adrian said, "but it is my mistake to make." Lady Stanhope left without another word, the door closing behind her with a sharp click. Margot let out a slow breath, her hands still trembling, and Adrian crossed to the table and sat down across from her. "She will go to Viscount Carteret," Margot said. He nodded once. "I know." "And he will withdraw Phoebe." "I know that too." "Then why are you doing this?" Adrian looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, his expression was completely unguarded. No performance, no ducal authority, just a man who had spent 5 years standing on ground he had never earned and was finally admitting it. "Because my brother would have," he said, "and because you asked me to." Viscount Carteret arrived at Stanhope Park 3 days later, his carriage rattling up the drive in the early afternoon, and by the time the housekeeper announced his presence, Adrian was already standing in the drawing room, waiting. Margot was not present. She had been dismissed to the servants' quarters by Lady Stanhope with a curt instruction to stay out of sight. But she heard the raised voices from the hallway outside the drawing room, and she stood at the top of the stairs, listening. "You cannot be serious," Carteret said, his voice carrying through the closed door. "You are proposing to transfer the dower house to a maid, based on a deed from 1787? "I am proposing to transfer the dower house to Samuel Crew's granddaughter based on a deed that was legally filed and never fulfilled," Adrian replied. "The debt is real, Carteret, and it is owed. The debt is 40 years old. No court in England would enforce it." "Then I will not require a court. I will transfer the property voluntarily." There was a long pause, and then Carteret spoke again, his voice lower and harder. "If you do this, the settlement is void. I will not marry my daughter into a disputed estate. Do you understand that?" He answered without hesitation. "I understand." "Then resolve the claim quietly. Pay the woman whatever she wants, and have her sign a release. But do not acknowledge the debt publicly. Do not transfer the property. And do not disrupt the settlement over this. The dower house was never mine to include in the settlement," Adrian said. "It belongs to Samuel Crew's family. I cannot offer Phoebe property that is not mine to give." "Then offer her something else," Carteret snapped. "Renegotiate the jointure. Increase the cash settlement. But do not do this, Stanhope. Do not throw away this alliance over a surveyor's claim from the last century." "The alliance was built on a lie," Adrian said quietly. "I will not perpetuate it." Carteret's response was a single word, sharp and final. "Then we are done." The door opened, and Carteret strode into the hallway, his face flushed with anger. He did not look at Margot as he passed, but she saw the set of his jaw and knew that the alliance was over. That afternoon, Phoebe found Margot in the servants' corridor. Margot was carrying a tray of linens to the laundry when Phoebe stepped out of the side passage, blocking her path. Phoebe was dressed in a pale green walking dress, her hair pinned in a simple arrangement, and her expression was calm and composed. Not angry, not hurt, just clear. "Miss Hollis," Phoebe said. "A word." Margot set down the tray and straightened. "My lady." Phoebe studied her for a moment, her gaze moving over Margot's face with the same careful attention she had given the silk samples in the dining room. "My father has withdrawn the settlement. The engagement is not yet broken, but it will be unless the Duke resolves your claim." She spoke evenly. "I understand, my lady. Do you?" Phoebe's voice was not unkind, but it was direct. "If the Duke transfers the dower house to you, my jointure is reduced by £200 a year. My settlement becomes less attractive. My marriage becomes more complicated. And your position here at Stanhope Park is finished. Do you understand that?" Margot confirmed it. "Yes, my lady." "Then why are you pursuing this?" Margot met her gaze without flinching. "My grandfather measured every foot of the eastern boundary in the winter of 1786. He slept in barns. He walked through snow. He spent 2 years of his life mapping this estate. And he won the chancery case that secured 400 acres for this family. He was promised a house. He was given a deed. And when he asked for what he was owed, the Duke's solicitor threatened him with prosecution for fraud. He died in a rented cottage 10 years later, and my mother spent her life taking in mending to survive. My position was finished 40 years ago, my lady. I am simply the first person in my family to say so." Phoebe's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or respect. She nodded once, a small, precise movement. "I see," she said. "Then I will not ask you to withdraw." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, and Margot stood alone with the tray of linens, her heart pounding and her hands steady. That evening, Margot returned to the archive. She had not been summoned, but she had nowhere else to go, and the archive had become the only place in Stanhope Park where she felt she had a right to exist. She found Adrian there, standing at the table with a rolled map spread in front of him, his hands flat on the edges to hold it open. He looked up when she entered, and his expression was weary but not defeated. Carteret withdrew the settlement, he said. She had expected it. I heard. Phoebe spoke to you. Her answer was brief. Yes. Adrian straightened, rolling the map closed. What did she say? She said my position here is finished if you transfer the house, Margot said. She was not wrong. And what did you say? I told her my grandfather was owed a house, and he died in a rented cottage, Margot said, and that my position was finished 40 years ago. Adrian's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. That must have been a conversation. It was brief, Margot said. They stood on opposite sides of the table, the archive quiet around them, and Margot felt the weight of the question she had been carrying since the moment she had read the solicitor's letter. Your Grace, she said. What would your grandfather have done if my grandfather had come to him directly, without a solicitor, and asked for what he was owed? Adrian's smile faded. My grandfather would have threatened him, just as his solicitor did. And what would your grandfather have done if my grandfather had refused to withdraw? He would have destroyed him, Adrian said quietly. He would have filed a countersuit, tied him up in court for years, and bankrupted him. My grandfather was not a kind man, Miss Hollis. He was a man who believed that power gave him the right to take whatever he wanted and crush anyone who objected. And you are not that man, Margot said. His voice was firm. No, I am not. Then prove it. Adrian looked at her, and the distance between them, the table, the archives, the 40 years of silence, seemed to collapse into a single moment of understanding. I will, he said. The study was dark when Margot entered. The fire in the grate burned down to embers and the lamps unlit. Adrian sat at his desk, the solicitor's letter and Samuel Crew's notebook spread in front of him. And he did not look up when she closed the door behind her. She had come without being summoned, carrying the transfer deed from the county registry and the chancery case record that Mr. Aldridge had reluctantly provided. And she placed both documents on the desk in front of Adrian with the same precision her grandfather had used to mark a boundary stone. Adrian looked at the documents, then at her, and his expression was unreadable. These are the originals, he said. She confirmed it. Yes, Your Grace. You could take these to a solicitor in town, Adrian said. Pursue the claim independently. You do not need me. Her voice was measured. No, I do not need you. But my grandfather tried the independent route. He filed the claim, demanded payment, and was threatened with prosecution. He trusted the law, and the law did nothing because the law serves men like your grandfather, not men like mine. If I take these documents to a solicitor, I will spend years in court and lose everything I have in the process. Or I can trust you to do what your grandfather refused. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady on hers. I am asking you to trust a Langford, after everything my family did to yours. She spoke plainly. Yes, you are asking a great deal. She pulled out the chair across from his desk, the chair reserved for guests, for solicitors, for men of rank, and sat down. She did not ask permission. She simply sat, a maid in a duke's study, and Adrian did not correct her. He watched her, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been respect. And then he leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "What do you want, Miss Hollis?" he asked. "Not what your grandfather was owed. What do you want?" Margot met his gaze without flinching. "I want what my grandfather was owed. The house, the acknowledgement, and the truth spoken aloud in front of the people who benefited from the theft. I want Viscount Carteret to know that the dower house was never yours to offer his daughter. I want Lady Stanhope to know that her husband's estate was built on stolen labor. And I want you to stand in front of them and say it. Not quietly, not in a solicitor's office, in front of witnesses." Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. A single, decisive movement. "I will arrange it," he said. "When?" "1 week," Adrian said. "I will invite the family to supper. Phoebe, Carteret, my mother, Mr. Aldridge. I will present the evidence, transfer the deed, and acknowledge the debt in front of all of them. Does that satisfy you?" Her answer was immediate. "Yes." Adrian stood, and Margot stood with him, the desk between them no longer a barrier, but a shared space where two people had made a decision that could not be undone. Adrian looked at the documents on the desk, then at her. "Your grandfather trusted my family," he said, "and it cost him everything." She gave him the truth again. "Yes. I am asking you to trust me." She acknowledged it. "I know. And if I fail you, then I will take these documents to a solicitor in London," Margot said. "And I will spend the rest of my life in court if I must. But I do not think you will fail me, Your Grace." Adrian's expression softened, and he reached across the desk, his hand hovering over hers for a moment before he withdrew it. "1 week," he said. "I promise." Margot picked up the documents and left the study, her heart pounding and her hands steady. And as she walked down the corridor, she felt the weight of 40 years of silence lifting from her shoulders, one measured step at a time. The following morning, Lady Stanhope summoned the housekeeper to her private sitting room and issued a single, unambiguous command. Margot Hollis was to be dismissed from service immediately, her belongings packed, and her departure arranged for that evening. The housekeeper, who had served the Stanhope family for 30 years and knew better than to question a direct order, delivered the message to Margot in the servants' hall with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen maids come and go and did not trouble herself with their reasons for leaving. Margot listened without protest. She climbed the narrow stairs to her room, a small chamber under the eaves with a single window and a bed that creaked when she sat on it. And she watched as the housekeeper's assistant packed her belongings into a worn leather case, her dresses, her apron, her mother's shawl, and the small wooden box that held Samuel Crew's surveying instruments. The assistant worked quickly, folding each item with practiced hands, and Margot did not speak. There was nothing to say. She had known this would come the moment she had sat down in Adrian's study and claimed the chair that was not hers to take. By mid-afternoon, her case was packed and waiting by the door, and Margot stood at the window, looking out over the grounds of Stanhope Park, the long gravel drive, the formal gardens, the line of trees that marked the eastern boundary her grandfather had mapped. She had been here for 6 months, and she had learned the rhythms of the house, the hierarchy of the servants, the particular silence that came with being invisible. Now she was leaving, and the house would continue without her, just as it had continued without her grandfather. The door opened without a knock, and Adrian entered, his expression tight and his jaw set. He looked at the packed case, then at Margot, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. "My mother dismissed you," he said. She stated the fact. "Yes, Your Grace." "Without consulting me." "She is the mistress of the house, Your Grace. She has the authority." She does not have the authority to dismiss you while you are assisting me with an estate matter, Adrian said sharply. He turned to the housekeeper's assistant, who was hovering near the door. Unpack Miss Hollis's belongings. She is not leaving. The assistant looked from Adrian to Margot, her expression uncertain, and then she bobbed a curtsy and hurried from the room. Adrian crossed to the window and stood beside Margot, his gaze on the eastern boundary. You will remain at Stanhope Park until the matter is resolved, he said. Your access to the archive is not to be restricted, and you are not to be dismissed by anyone without my express permission. Is that clear? She understood. Yes, Your Grace. Adrian turned to look at her, and his expression softened. I am sorry. I should have anticipated this. You cannot control your mother, Your Grace. His voice was resolute. No, but I can countermand her orders, and I will. He left without another word, and Margot stood at the window, her heart pounding and her hands trembling slightly, and she wondered how long it would be before Lady Stanhope found another way to remove her from the house. That evening, Margot sat on a bench outside the archive, deciding whether to leave anyway. The bench was tucked into a small alcove overlooking the garden, a place where servants sometimes came to rest between tasks, and Margot had found it by accident during her first week at Stanhope Park. It was quiet here, away from the main house, and the air smelled of lavender and turned earth. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her grandfather's compass in her apron pocket, and she thought about her mother's last words. He deserved better. We all did. She could leave tonight, pack her case again, walk down the drive, and take the coach to London. She had the documents. She had the proof. She could find a solicitor who would take the case on contingency and spend the next 5 years in court, fighting for what her grandfather had been owed. Or she could stay, trust Adrian to keep his promise, and risk losing everything if he failed. The sound of footsteps on gravel made her look up. Adrian was walking toward her, his coat unbuttoned and his hands in his pockets, and he stopped a few paces from the bench, his expression uncertain. May I sit? He asked. Margot nodded, and he sat beside her, the bench creaking slightly under his weight. They sat in silence for a moment, the garden darkening around them as the sun set, and then Adrian reached into his pocket and withdrew a small brass object that caught the fading light. It was her grandfather's surveying compass. The housekeeper packed this, Adrian said. I thought you might want it back. He placed the compass in her palm and closed her fingers around it, his hand staying around hers for a long moment, warm, steady, deliberate. Margot felt the weight of the compass, the smooth brass worn by her grandfather's hands, and she felt the warmth of Adrian's hand over hers, and she did not pull away. This is yours, Adrian said quietly. Everything your grandfather left is yours, including the house. Your mother dismissed me, Margot said. My mother does not decide who stays. Adrian said, I do, and you are not leaving. If I leave tonight, I lose access to the archive. Margot said, I lose the evidence. I lose everything. You are not leaving tonight, Adrian said, or tomorrow, or the day after. You are staying until the debt is paid, and then you are staying because you choose to, not because I tell you to. His hand tightened around hers, and Margot looked at him, at the Duke who had spent 5 years performing a role he had never wanted, and was finally, slowly, becoming the man he was meant to be. She turned her hand in his, her fingers curling around the compass and around his fingers, and they sat together in the fading light, two people who had been standing on stolen ground and were finally, slowly, finding their way to solid earth. After a long moment, Adrian released her hand, and Margot pocketed the compass. They sat in silence as the light faded completely. And then Adrian stood and offered her his hand. "Come," he said. "We have work to do." Margot took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. And together, they walked back to the archive, where Samuel Crew's notebooks waited, and the truth was still being measured, one careful line at a time. The archive was quiet the night before the supper. The only sound, the rustle of paper and the faint creak of the floorboards as Margot moved between the shelves. She had spent the day reviewing every document they had found: the field notebooks, the chancery case record, the solicitor's letter, the deed. And she had copied the key passages into her own notebook, her handwriting as precise as her grandfather's. She needed to be certain. She needed to know that when Adrian stood in front of Viscount Carteret and Lady Stanhope and Phoebe and spoke the truth would be unassailable. The door opened, and Adrian entered, closing it behind him with a soft click. He was in shirt sleeves, his coat discarded somewhere between the study and the archive, and he looked tired, the kind of tired that came from days of pressure and sleepless nights. He crossed to the table where Margot was working and stood on the opposite side, his hands resting on the edge. "You are still here," he said. "I wanted to review the documents one more time," Margot said. And they are complete," Margot said. "Every measurement, every witness, every record. There is no gap, no error. My grandfather did the work, and your grandfather owed him the house." Adrian nodded slowly, his gaze on the documents spread across the table. "Tomorrow I will either pay the debt or I will not. I need to know which you believe I will do." Margot set down her pen and looked at him across the table, across the maps and ledgers and 40 years of silence. "I believe you will pay it." "Why?" "Because you have spent the last 2 weeks reading my grandfather's notebooks," Margot said. "Because you countermanded your mother's order to dismiss me. Because you told Viscount Carteret that the dower house was never yours to offer. And because you are standing here the night before the supper, asking me if I trust you, when you could have simply done nothing and let the claim die." Adrian's hands tightened on the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "I do not want to be the kind of man my grandfather was." She spoke with certainty. "You are not." "How do you know?" "Because my grandfather trusted your family, and your grandfather destroyed him for it," Margot said. "And I am trusting you, and you have not destroyed me. Not yet." Adrian let out a slow breath, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he moved around the table, closing the distance between them, and stood beside her. He placed both hands flat on the map spread in front of them, the eastern boundary, the line Samuel Crew had drawn in ink that had faded to brown. And he leaned forward, his voice low and rough. "I will pay it," he said. "I promise you, Miss Hollis. I will stand in front of my mother and Carteret and Phoebe, and I will tell them what my grandfather did, and I will transfer the deed to you. And if they withdraw, if the alliance collapses, if I lose everything, I will still pay it. Because it is owed, and because you walked into this house 6 months ago, and you have been standing on your grandfather's ground without knowing it. And I have been standing on your grandfather's ground without deserving it. And tomorrow I would like to be the kind of man my brother would have been." His voice broke on the word brother, and Margot heard the grief beneath the words. The grief for the man who should have inherited, who would have found the deed and paid the debt without hesitation, who had died at 19 and left Adrian to carry a role he had never wanted. It was the first time she had heard Adrian's voice break, the first time she had seen the performance crack completely, and she felt something shift in her chest. Something that was not pity but recognition. She moved around the table and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she placed her hand on the map next to his. Not on his hand, but beside it, their smallest fingers touching. They stood together over Samuel Crew's work, over the measurements he had made in the winter of 1786. And what passed between them was not the silence of a duke and a maid, but the silence of two people who had found the same truth and were finally, slowly, learning to stand on solid ground. "Your brother would have been proud of you," Margot said quietly. Adrian's hand shifted, his smallest finger curling around hers, and they stood together in the archive as the night deepened. The maps and notebooks spread before them like a path they had walked together and would walk again tomorrow, in front of witnesses, in the light. The dining room at Stanhope Park had been prepared for a family supper. The long mahogany table set for 8, with the estate's finest china and silver. Candles burned in the candelabra, casting warm light across the polished wood, and the portraits of Adrian's ancestors watched from the walls with the same impassive expressions they had worn for 200 years. Margot stood at the sideboard, her hands folded in front of her, her posture straight and her gaze steady. She was dressed in her maid's uniform, her hair pinned neatly, and she looked like what she was, a servant attending a formal supper. But she was not here to serve. She was here to witness. The guests had arrived over the course of the afternoon. Phoebe, cool and composed in a pale blue gown. Viscount Carteret, his expression tight with disapproval. Lady Stanhope, her posture rigid and her mouth set in a thin line. Mr. Aldridge, the estate solicitor, carrying a leather document case and looking deeply uncomfortable. And 4 others, distant cousins and estate managers, whose names Margot did not know, but whose presence made the supper feel less like a family gathering and more like a tribunal. Adrian stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the back of his chair, and he waited until the room had settled into silence before he spoke. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I have asked you here tonight because I need to address a matter that affects the estate and the Carteret settlement. Mr. Aldridge, if you would." Aldridge opened his document case and withdrew 2 documents. The original deed from the county registry, yellowed and brittle at the edges, and the chancery case record, bound in leather and stamped with the court seal. He placed both on the table beside Adrian's grandfather's portrait, and the room went still. Adrian picked up the deed and held it so that everyone at the table could see it. In 1786, a surveyor named Samuel Crew was hired by my grandfather to settle a boundary dispute with the neighboring estate. The dispute involved 400 acres of land, including 3 tenant farms, the mill, and the dower house. Mr. Crew spent 2 years surveying the boundary, measuring every field and hedgerow, and testifying in chancery. His work won the case and secured the disputed land for this estate. He set down the deed and picked up the chancery record. The agreed payment for Mr. Crew's work was the dower house and its grounds. The deed was drawn, witnessed by the estate solicitor and a magistrate, and filed at the county registry in July 1787. The payment was documented. The debt was acknowledged. And then my grandfather never transferred the property. Viscount Carteret leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "What bearing does this have on the settlement? Stanhope?" "The dower house is part of Lady Phoebe's jointure," Adrian said. "It was included in the settlement as part of the estate's assets. But the dower house does not belong to the estate. It belongs to Samuel Crew's family." Lady Stanhope's voice was sharp. "Adrian, this matter was resolved decades ago." "It was not resolved," Adrian said, his voice cutting through hers with a clarity that silenced the room. "It was silenced my grandfather's solicitor sent Mr. Crewe a letter threatening him with prosecution for fraud if he continued to demand payment. Mr. Crewe was a working man without legal resources, and he withdrew. He died 10 years later in a rented cottage. The debt was never paid. It was suppressed through intimidation. He turned to look at Margot, standing at the sideboard, and the room followed his gaze. Margot felt the weight of their attention. Phoebe's cool assessment, Carteret's disapproval, Lady Stanhope's fury. But she did not look away. She met Adrian's gaze and held it. "Miss Hollis," Adrian said, his voice steady and clear. "Your grandfather surveyed the eastern boundary of this estate. He won the chancery case that secured 400 acres for this family. The dower house was his payment. The deed was filed, witnessed, and never fulfilled. I am transferring the property to you, along with the arrears on 40 years of unpaid rent. Mr. Aldridge has drawn the papers." The room erupted. Carteret's voice rose in protest, demanding to know how this affected the settlement. Lady Stanhope stood, her face pale with fury, insisting that Adrian was destroying the family's reputation. One of the cousins asked whether the claim was even enforceable after so many years. Aldridge, looking miserable, tried to explain the legal precedent, but his voice was drowned out by the others. Adrian did not raise his voice. He simply waited, his gaze still on Margot, until the room quieted again. Then he crossed to the sideboard and held out the transfer document, not as a gift, not as charity, but as a debt paid. "This was owed to your family before I was born," Adrian said. "I am sorry it took 40 years. Margot took the document. She read it slowly, her hands steady, and when she looked up, her voice was calm and clear. "My grandfather measured every foot of the eastern boundary in the winter of 1786, she said. 2 years of work. He slept in barns. He walked through snow. He was a precise man, and he did the work he was hired to do. He was promised a house. He was given a deed. And when he asked for what he was owed, your grandfather's solicitor threatened him with prosecution. He died in a rented cottage, and my mother spent her life taking in mending because her father was cheated out of the house he earned." She looked at Adrian, then at the others around the table. "This is not charity, Your Grace. This is a debt paid, and I accept it." Phoebe spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but steady. "And the settlement?" Adrian turned to her. "The settlement will need to be renegotiated without the dower house. If that changes your answer, I understand." Phoebe looked at her father. Carteret was already calculating, his expression tight, and Phoebe's mouth curved into a small, wry smile. "It changes the terms," she said. "Not necessarily the answer. But I need a week to consider." Carteret stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is unacceptable, Stanhope. You are acknowledging a claim that will reduce my daughter's jointure and complicate the alliance. If you proceed with this, the settlement is void." His response was unwavering. "Then it is void." Carteret stared at him for a long moment, and then he turned to Phoebe. "We are leaving." Phoebe rose with the same grace she had shown in the dining room 6 months ago, when she had laughed at the idea of a maid holding a deed. But she did not laugh now. She looked at Margot, then at Adrian, and she nodded once, a small, precise gesture that might have been acknowledgement or might have been respect. "1 week, she said. "I will send word." She left with her father, and the others followed, the room emptying until only Adrian, Margot, and Mr. Aldridge remained. Aldridge gathered the documents with shaking hands, his face pale, and he left without a word, closing the door behind him. Margot stood at the sideboard, the transfer document in her hands, and Adrian stood at the head of the table, the candlelight casting shadows across his face. They looked at each other across the length of the room, and what stretched between them was not the silence of a duke and a maid, but the silence of two people who had walked through fire together and had come out on the other side. "Thank you," Margot said quietly. Adrian crossed the room and stood beside her. He did not touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. And when he spoke, his voice was low and rough. "Your grandfather deserved better," he said. "And so did you." Margot looked at the document in her hands, at the deed that had been owed for 40 years and was finally hers. She spoke the simple truth. "Yes, we did." Days later, the dining room at Stanhope Park was quiet. The table cleared and the chairs pushed back into place. Margot stood at the head of the table, in the chair Adrian usually occupied, the transfer deed spread in front of her. She was reading it for perhaps the 10th time, her fingers tracing the words that made the dower house and its grounds legally hers. And she did not hear Adrian enter until he spoke. "You are in my seat," he said. Margot looked up. Adrian stood in the doorway, his coat unbuttoned and his expression amused, and she did not move. "I am in my grandfather's house," she said. Adrian crossed the room and pulled out the chair beside hers, sitting down without asking permission. "Not yet. The dower house is half a mile east." "I am practicing," Margot said. Adrian's mouth curved into a smile, the real one, the one that had arrived only after he had stopped performing the role of Duke and had started becoming the man he was meant to be. He looked at the deed, then at her, and his expression softened. "When will you move?" he asked. "Next week," Margot said. "The house needs repairs. The roof leaks and the windows are cracked. But it is mine." He agreed simply. "It is yours." They sat together in the dining room where Phoebe had laughed 6 months ago, where the deed had first surfaced, and Margot felt the weight of the journey they had taken from that moment of laughter to this moment of quiet triumph. And she knew that the distance between the two was the distance her grandfather had walked in the cold, measuring boundaries that no one had paid him to secure. Spring came to the dower house like a slow unfurling, the gardens waking from winter and the light falling through the repaired windows in clean, bright squares. Margot stood at the window in what had been the drawing room and was now her office, looking out over the view her grandfather had been promised and had never seen. The room was small, but well-proportioned, with a desk positioned to catch the afternoon light and shelves lining the walls for the instruments and notebooks she had inherited. Samuel Crew's surveying tools sat on the desk beside her own. His compass, his measuring chains, his field notebooks. And on the wall above the desk, she had hung the original deed, framed and preserved, a reminder of what had been owed and what had finally been paid. She had opened a surveying office. The work came slowly at first. A boundary dispute for a tenant farmer, a land assessment for a widow selling her late husband's property. But word spread, and by the end of the first month, she had more clients than she could manage alone. She worked with the same precision her grandfather had used, measuring twice, recording every detail, and writing margin notes about the weather and the light. The work was hers, and the house was hers, and for the first time in her life, she was standing on ground that no one could take from her. The sound of hoofbeats on gravel made her look up. Adrian was riding up the drive, a rolled map tucked under one arm, and he dismounted at the front door with the easy grace of a man who had spent his childhood on horseback. Margot met him at the door, and he handed her the map without preamble. "A boundary question," he said. "From the Carteret estate. Phoebe's father has a dispute with his northern neighbor, and Phoebe suggested you handle it." Margot took the map, surprised. "Phoebe suggested me?" "She said you are the best surveyor in the county," Adrian said. "She is not wrong." Margot unrolled the map on the desk and studied it, her trained eye picking out the boundary markers and the discrepancies in the measurements. After a moment, she looked up. "The northern boundary is 15 chains too far east," she said. "Viscount Carteret has been farming land that is not his." Adrian's mouth twitched. "That seems to be a family tradition." Margot smiled despite herself. "Sit down. This will take an hour." "I have the afternoon," Adrian said. "You have a wedding in 6 weeks." Adrian sat in the chair across from her desk, his posture relaxed and his gaze steady. "I have the afternoon." Margot began to measure, her hands moving over the map with practiced precision, and Adrian watched her work in silence. His hand found the edge of the map she was holding, their fingers overlapping on the border line, and neither of them adjusted. The compass on the desk, Samuel Crew's compass, caught the afternoon light, and the room was quiet except for the scratch of Margot's pen and the distant sound of birds in the garden. The courtship did not announce itself. It grew the way a survey grew, measurement by measurement, one verified point at a time. Adrian visited for boundary questions, and Margot solved them. He stayed for tea, and she let him. One afternoon he arrived without a map, and she noticed, but said nothing. She poured 2 cups, and they sat together in the drawing room, talking about the estate and the tenants and the repairs she was making to the house. And when he left, she stood at the window and watched him ride down the drive. And she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for as long as she could remember. Phoebe had released him, not from cruelty, but from clarity. She had looked at Adrian during the week she had taken to consider the revised settlement, and she had seen the way he looked at Margot, the way a map looks at a compass, and she had known that he was not hers and never had been. She had married Viscount Harding in September, a kind man with an estate in Derbyshire, and she had sent Margot a boundary map of her new property with a note written in her elegant hand. "My northern hedge is suspect. Come when you can." Margot had gone, and she had walked the boundary with Phoebe, and they had spoken as equals. Not as maid and mistress, but as 2 women who had both been standing on uncertain ground and had found their footing in different ways. Phoebe had asked about Adrian, and Margot had told her the truth, that he visited, that they worked together, that she did not know what would come of it, but that she was willing to wait and see. Phoebe had smiled and said that sounded like the beginning of something worth measuring. The dower house in late spring was a place of light and order. The rooms filled with the scent of beeswax and lavender, the garden blooming with flowers Margot had planted herself. She worked at her desk in the afternoons, the windows open to let in the breeze, and Adrian came when he could, sometimes with a map and sometimes without. They measured boundaries together, and they drank tea together. And one afternoon, when the light was particularly good, Adrian arrived and found Margot in the garden, her hands covered in soil from planting roses along the eastern fence. He stood at the gate, watching her work, and when she looked up, he was smiling. "You are a surveyor," he said, "not a gardener." "I am both," Margot said. "My grandfather measured the land. I am planting it." Adrian crossed the garden and knelt beside her, his hands joining hers in the soil. And they planted the last rows together, their fingers brushing as they pressed the earth around the roots. When they finished, they stood, and Adrian did not step back. He stayed close, his hand finding hers, their fingers overlapping the way they had on the map. And he looked at her with the same steady gaze that had measured her worth in the archive and had never wavered. "I love you," he said. Margot's breath caught, and she felt the weight of the words settle over her like the deed had settled into her hands. Real, earned, hers. She looked at him, at the Duke who had paid his grandfather's debt and had stayed to see what grew in the ground they had cleared together. And she smiled. "I know," she said. "I love you too." He kissed her then, in the garden of the house her grandfather had earned, and she had claimed. And the compass on the desk inside caught the afternoon light, and the world felt, for the first time in 40 years, like it was standing on solid ground.